Yes, a very good morning to you, dear listeners. Welcome to Radio Sri Lanka. This is the 11th hour, and yes, you're with Radio Ceylon or Radio Sri Lanka, celebrating 95 years of service to the nation, the oldest in Asia and the third oldest in the world. And before I formally introduce our distinguished guest here in the studios this morning, I must say it is going to be a very, very special interview for me personally as well, because having interviewed many people and distinguished guests, tongue twister there already, isn't it? Distinguished guests over the years, I must say this is the first time I'm interviewing someone who has, I must say, taught me, reprimanded me, probably pulled me up as well on many occasions. So it's going to be a wonderful 40 minutes on the program. And when the directress asked me to interview this particular person, I was extremely honored and privileged to be given the opportunity, of course, and extremely, I can't say afraid, but maybe daunted. It was a very daunting experience at that moment, because I don't know what I'm in for. But anyway, it gives me immense pleasure to welcome Professor Dushyanthi Mendis here at the studio. A very warm welcome to you, Professor Dushyanthi Mendis. Thank you for taking time off your busy schedule and joining us here at the SLBC.
Thank you, Mario. It's my pleasure to be here.
And I need to formally introduce our professor this morning on the 11th hour. Professor Dushyanthi Mendis needs no introduction to the linguistic and literary circles in Sri Lanka, but we will be failing in our duties if we don't present a formal introduction. Professor Dushyanthi Mendis is Professor in English at the University of Colombo, Sri Lanka. She is equipped with a BA degree in English from the University of Peradeniya in the Hills, an MA in Linguistics from Ohio University in the USA, a PhD in Linguistics from the University of Michigan Ann Arbor in the USA, and has worked with world-renowned linguist John Swales many times. Professor Mendis researches in the broad fields of sociolinguistics, discourse analysis, and language planning and policy. Professor Mendis has been teaching at the University of Colombo for more than 25 years. She is a member of the Official Languages Commission and is on the academic board of the National Institute of Language Education Training. She is a former judge of the Gratian Award, many literary awards in Sri Lanka as well. Professor, the list goes on and on, but I will not be taking time off, to introduce you even more. A very warm welcome to you, Professor. Once again, thank you for being here.
You're very welcome, Mario, and thank you again.
Professor, we are going to talk about languages and their importance to women. Now, I have been your student, and linguistics and language, the language aspect is perhaps not my forte, you know that. But languages and their importance to women. But before we get to the crux of the subject matter this morning, Professor, you are representing today the Official Languages Commission of Sri Lanka. What is the Official Languages Commission of Sri Lanka? And if you could tell our listeners out there the role, scope, the services, and overall what essentially the Official Languages Commission of Sri Lanka does.
Well, Mario, the Official Languages Commission of Sri Lanka was established in 1991 by an Act of Parliament. There are 6 members who serve on the commission. They are all appointed by His Excellency the President, and one of those members is the chairperson of the commission. The commission has 3 members who are academics representing the 3 major languages. So I represent English, as you know, and there are 2 other academics who represent Sinhala and Tamil. The role of the commission, broadly speaking, is to ensure the implementation of Sri Lanka's official language policy in all institutions and organizations that serve the public.
Okay.
Now, under this role, or under this scope, if you will, there are 4 broad objectives that the Commission looks to. And those are, first, to recommend principles of policy pertaining to or relating to the use of Sri Lanka's official languages. That would be Sinhala and Tamil. Okay. This is an advisory function that the Commission plays. Secondly, to monitor and supervise compliance with the provisions regarding the language use as set out in Sri Lanka's constitution.
Okay.
In addition, the Official Languages Commission also has the authority to conduct investigations.
Okay.
Into the violations of Sri Lanka's official language policy, as well as to any complaints that they might receive about the violation to language rights or the language policy. They can take remedial action.
Okay.
And finally, they perform a very important outreach, a community outreach function, which is part of their educational program.
Okay.
Where they go into schools as well as other public institutions and organizations to raise awareness about language use in Sri Lanka. And in schools, they do things like help to establish language circles as well as language societies.
Okay, so Professor, when you think about language in this country at a very general level, one thinks of schools and tertiary bodies. One very rarely thinks about a commission actually appointed to look into these functions that you highlighted. So, in a way, the Official Languages Commission of Sri Lanka is an extremely important body, isn't it?
It is, because it is empowered to perform functions that, to the best of my knowledge, no other commission in this country is empowered to do.
Okay.
So it is indeed it performs a very important service to the country, because under its purview are all the public institutions and organizations which serve the public. So what the OLC, or the Official Languages Commission, does is to ensure that those public institutions in serving the public adhere to Sri Lanka's official language policy.
And Professor, if you could just talk a bit about the official languages law of Sri Lanka. We don't have to go into detail, but this is very interesting. When you think of law, you think of criminal law, you think of, other facets of law, but an official languages law?
Well, the what you refer to as the official languages law is, I assume, the policy stated as it is stated in the Constitution.
Yes.
And you can find it's very clearly stated in Article 18, Chapter 4 of Sri Lanka's Constitution. And it basically sets out the fact that both Sinhala and Tamil are official languages in Sri Lanka, and that English is the link language. Article 19 goes on to further state that both Sinhala and Tamil also perform the function or have the status of national languages. That, in a nutshell, is Sri Lanka's official language policy.
So, Professor, as a professor in English, why is English still only a link language? Okay,
so I would perhaps answer that question with a question of my own, which is, what else should it be? I think there are two options here. It could either be an official language or it could be a national language. Right? Let's go with the second one first for a moment. Usually the term national language is given to a language or languages which have a close connection with the community or the nation. Or it could be a language or languages which are spoken in a particular region of a nation state. That's what is usually termed a national language. So if you look at it from that perspective, English really doesn't fit the bill very well, does it? We can't really say that there's a close connection with either of the major ethnic groups which constitute Sri Lanka. And if we look at it in terms of who speaks English and who calls English their first language or mother tongue, that would be the Burgher population in Sri Lanka. But unfortunately, they represent only something like maybe 0.1%, or maybe even less. of Sri Lanka's population. So it would be hard to justify that English should be given the status of a national language in Sri Lanka. Okay. Now let's look at the other alternative or the other option, which would be to give English the status of an official language. And I would argue here that English already seems to have the de facto status of an official language anyway.
But de facto being the key word there.
De facto being the key word, because it's not in the law, as it were. But if you look at important documents like our passports, for example, they are printed in all three languages.
Yes.
So somebody could easily be forgiven for thinking that English is actually an official language in Sri Lanka. Then going back to the constitution, if you look at the constitution, you will see that English is given parity of status with Tamil in some cases, because the constitution states that any person in Sri Lanka can ask for a translation in English or Tamil if they don't understand Sinhala, right? So there's parity of status there with Tamil.
Yes.
Okay, so there are a lot of official functions that English performs in Sri Lanka, but as I said earlier, de facto.
So, Professor Dushyanthi, what are we linking as English being the link language then?
That's a very good question, because if you look at the constitution, it doesn't tell you what is being linked or what English is supposed to link. So I can only speculate here. I'm assuming that initially English was supposed to link the Sinhala speaking and the Tamil speaking people who did not share a common language. I'm not entirely sure that is actually working, because I feel that a better way of linking these two communities and also bringing about social harmony, which is very important, I believe, in Sri Lanka, is to get each community to learn the other language, or what is now called the other national language or the second national language, rather than English. That is my opinion. So
essentially, English was to, or I would say is to link communal harmony and to bring in a dialogue or to facilitate communication between, say, different communities without conforming to one particular language as such.
That may have been the original idea or the ideology behind calling English a link language in Sri Lanka. But as I said earlier, I'm not entirely sure that has worked.
So then, Professor, can we still call it a link language?
Indeed, we can. Anyone can call anything for that matter. But the point is, does it actually work in that sense? And another point that I want to raise at this point is that if anyone thinks that English is a neutral language or can perform as a neutral medium to bring together, shall we say, two conflicting communities, the Sinhalese and the Tamils, the problem is no language is neutral. Every language comes with its own baggage and its own ideology. And as you know very well, Mario, English has a lot of baggage, a lot of prestige attached to it. A lot of discrimination happens in the name of English in Sri Lanka.
I must agree with you on that, Professor. And I think things are changing, but perhaps the pace at which it is changing is the problem. We'll take a short musical interlude and we'll be back with Professor Dushyanthi Mendis, and we'll be talking very, very specifically about languages and their importance to women, celebrating Women's Day, which took place very recently as well. And we'll be talking a bit about language education and very, very importantly about English as a tool as opposed to a weapon. And I think there's a very, very important word that the university community uses and students use. So, Professor, you'll be talking about that as well. Professor Dushyanthi Mendis. And, Professor, once again, it's a privilege to have you here with us in the studios. Getting to the topic, Professor Mendis, languages and their importance to women. Let me ask you this question. Why language and women specifically? And I'm going to ask you a very perhaps obvious question, but it may not be obvious to the larger listenership out there, because sometimes, Professor, now we may not stop and think about certain things. Yes, you have taught us how to think about these specific things, so that is why it may sound obvious to you. Is language gendered?
Well, Mario, I would say, and this might be controversial, but I would say yes and no. to your question as to whether language is gendered. Let me make it clear right at the start that I don't believe that there is a biological difference in terms of language use.
Okay.
I think differences, when they do come about, are because of social influences and attitudes. So if there is gendered language, and yes, there is, that's why I said it's a yes and no question. Gendered language, I would say, is a result of social constructs and attitudes and beliefs. But otherwise, I would not say that there is a biological difference in terms of language use.
And permit me to say this, as a woman on the commission, and you speak for the other women as well in society, and especially as this program is in celebration of Women's Day. Is language, Professor, used in a particular manner to marginalize and discriminate women?
I would say that language can be used in a particular way to marginalize and discriminate anyone.
Yes.
But perhaps there might be an increased perception of discrimination against women, because I once had a student who did a very small-scale informal research study about taboo words used for women and taboo words used for men.
Yeah.
And she found out, I think she did her study in a couple of offices in and around Colombo, and she found out that there were more taboo words used against women than there were used against men. Yes, but that's, just a very small scale study, so I'm not using that to prove anything, but it's possible that the English language as well as the Sinhala language, I don't think she looked into Tamil, it was English and Sinhalese that she looked at. Perhaps those two languages have more words in their lexicon which are derogatory towards women than the words that are derogatory towards men. That's a possibility, but I can't speak to that with any degree of certainty.
And it is a bit ironic, isn't it, Professor? Many high achievers in the field of English literature and linguistics in this country, across the board, not just in universities and universities centered in Colombo, but even in the peripheral universities, especially if you look at language departments. I'm not talking only of the Department of English and Linguistics or the Department of English Language Teaching, but languages in general. There are very, very strong women in these, not only academic, but administrative decision-making capacities as well. So it's a bit ironic if the language is used to further perhaps marginalize or taboo, as you said, a specific or a particular gender.
Yes, but that is a social phenomenon, isn't it? There's no scientific basis to it, obviously. It's just how the social perception of women, I think, and how women are objectified. But if we look at it in terms of, now you mentioned the fact that there are women in high positions who have achieved a lot. I'm not sure whether that's to do with language per se, but I can tell you this. Research has shown that children, as they're growing up from about, 2 years or so till about 10 years, girl children or female children are better at language than boys. Or male children. They seem to be better achievers. Of course, there are exceptions to every rule, and there are exceptions, but the trend is that girls are somehow better at acquiring the language at that young age. That's one thing. A second thing is, because you asked me earlier about women and language and why it's important, that there are two things which I consider to be important there, 2 points which came to mind. The first one is, in Sri Lanka at least, children in their infancy and when they're growing up spend most of their time with their mothers as opposed to their fathers. Again, there are exceptions to the rule, but it tends to be spending more time with their mothers. I think, and this may be the case in many other countries around the world as well, I think that women are aware of this, either subconsciously or consciously, because once again, research has shown, coming out of the United Kingdom, out of the UK, that women in working class families, I believe in Northern Ireland, if I'm not wrong, I could be wrong, so I'm not sure, their language, the language of the home that the women used was more correct, if you like, and more approximating the standard than the language of their husbands or partners. Right? And we can only speculate that perhaps the mothers were aware that they pass on their language to their children, in the sense that the children acquire the language in the home probably more from them than from the mothers, than from the fathers.
Okay.
And the mothers, the women, may have been making a greater effort to speak more correctly or pronounce more accurately. I mean, whatever those words are, it's all relative, isn't it?
I must pick up on that, Professor.
Okay.
Since you use the word correct and pronunciation now, I know it's something we've argued in class as well. But coming from Radio Ceylon, Professor, and having Niranjan on the other side there as well, pronunciation at Radio Ceylon and Radio Sri Lanka and radio, because, we were the first to start in Asia, is still really, really stressed on. And I think pronunciation in the language context, if I may say, is a huge problem today, because people are contesting, people are arguing, people are writing about, and people are essentially, I would also say, confused. Do we speak the language our way, or do we speak it their way? How do you speak it? So, for example, when you have media organizations, especially Radio Ceylon, that instill and insist on the so-called correct pronunciation, and of course, if pronunciation doesn't hamper the meaning of what you're saying, then it is okay. That's anything goes. So where as an academic, the intelligibility, thank you, Professor. Where as an academic, I think I've asked you this in class, but where does one draw the line? Where does it end? How do we overcome this challenge of pronunciation? Because a lot of our students, Professor, are very intelligent. They're very confident, very hardworking and persevering students. And I'm not talking about the students in Colombo. I'm talking about the students across the island. And something that really demotivates them, really makes them feel afraid is, am I speaking this correctly? Is it okay for me to speak it this way? So you have on one side people insisting on pronunciation, I'm not talking about accents, but people insisting on the correct pronunciation. And then on the other hand, you have the idea of intelligibility, as you highlighted. And where does one draw the line?
Okay, Mario, I'm assuming you are mostly talking about English in this case,
of
right?
Course.
Although what I'm going to say, I think, is pertains to Sinhala and Tamil as well.
Okay.
So when you talk about, or when we talk about accuracy and a standard, the question is, what is the standard?
Okay.
And in Sri Lanka, that question has not been adequately answered yet, as we have discussed in class. So this is one of the problems. There are also regional varieties of every language.
Professor, why hasn't it been addressed yet?
Because it is very difficult to do so.
Okay.
How do you establish... this is going to now make me go into a slightly different area. How are standards established?
Okay.
Think about that for a minute. Who establishes the standards?
Yeah.
That's another question, right? How do standards, particularly in case of language, get established? Can we write a book and say this is the way you're supposed to pronounce a particular word? Do you think everyone's going to follow that? I mean, from a very practical sense. And who makes that decision as to this is the way you are going to pronounce this particular word? Yeah. That's a problem.
Okay.
You see, in Sri Lanka, as we've discussed in class again, there are speakers of English who use it as a first or native language.
Yes.
There are a majority of speakers use it as a second language.
Okay.
And there are also speakers who use it as a third language.
Yes.
Now, these three categories of people have different pronunciations. They may even have different language use in terms of grammar. In fact, we know they do.
Yes.
Right? So then the question is, who sets the standard? That's the problem. I don't know if that answers the question you posed to me.
That does, and it makes me want to ask you more questions, but I think we'll be deviating from the topic because languages and their importance to women is what we should focus on this morning. But I must remind you, Professor, Radio Ceylon held the standard of pronunciation at a time, and I think it was looked up to, because I still remember my grandmother saying if she didn't know how to say a word in English, she would switch on the English service and probably listen to it. So I think maybe informal mechanisms like that, but today, of course, in the 21st century, everything has changed and technology plays a major role as well. But yes, as you said, it is very, very difficult as well to address that. But
locally, if I may interrupt you, Mario, locally as well as internationally.
Okay.
Because if you look at it internationally, which is the correct English? British, American, Indian, Sri Lankan.
Let me ask you that question, Professor. As a professor in English, what are you more comfortable with?
I'm most comfortable with Sri Lankan English because that's what I speak.
I knew you would say that.
That's what I speak. If you are going to ask me which I consider to be more correct, well, as a linguist, I can't say that because there is no one language that is better or more correct than another. And
do you speak Sri Lankan English, Professor?
Yes, of course.
Okay.
Because I know that I don't speak British English or American English or Indian English. I speak Sri Lankan English. And if I may say just one more thing about why languages are important, in my opinion, to women,
yes.
The question of literacy.
Okay.
Which is the ability to read and write. And you mentioned the 21st century.
Yes.
In the 21st century, if you cannot read or write, you are at a very disadvantageous position. You pretty much can't function.
Yes.
Right? So one of the things that we can be proud of in Sri Lanka is that literacy levels for women don't lag too far behind that for men.
Okay.
So here are the statistics. Women's literacy levels in Sri Lanka, according to the 2012 census, which is the most recent census we have, is 94.6%.
Okay.
Pretty high.
Yes.
Men's literacy levels are 96.9%.
Okay.
Pretty high, but very close, right?
Yes.
Compare that with India, for example. Men's literacy levels in India is at 82%.
Okay.
Whereas women is only 65.5%.
Okay.
That's a big gap.
Yes.
Take a look at Pakistan, 71% for men and 46% for women. So there's a big gap there. Large disparities between literacy levels of women and men. We don't have that. So we are very fortunate in Sri Lanka.
So in terms of language and their importance to women, as you said, we are very, very fortunate. But I think we need to talk about your opinion on very, very important, Professor, to differentiate accent and pronunciation, attitude and language, isn't it?
Well, yes. In terms of an accent, everybody has an accent because once again it's relative. So it all depends on perception. In terms of pronunciation, well, that is how you enunciate or voice the words of a language, the sounds of a language. Every language has a phonetic alphabet in addition to a letter alphabet, a graphic alphabet. And so it all depends on
the phonetic alphabet is incomprehensible sometimes.
Well, if you try to read
to
the
the
symbols...
non-linguist.
Yes.
To the non-linguist.
Yes, it will be difficult to read the symbols. But it all depends on how, again, possibly in a particular region, there might be a way of pronouncing a particular word in a different way. So that's how pronunciation changes. So we have regional accents, if you like, and we also have social accents. Now, social accents come about not because of a regional difference, but usually because of a group difference. So young people, for example, teenagers, adolescents, often have their own way of speaking. So you can call that a social accent or a social dialect. So there's a lot of variation going on in language, and that's what makes language such a fascinating thing to study.
Well today.
Exactly. So that's another type of language which in the university, as you know, we call digital discourses. We refer to that type of language use as digital discourses.
Professor Mendis, let's talk a bit about statistics and women in these language functions, Professor. Women in the university, in the tertiary level, also women at perhaps the Commission, Official Languages Commission. If you could talk a bit about the statistics, it'll be very interesting to our listeners out there.
Well, where the Official Languages Commission is concerned, one of the members of the commission is the commissioner of the Department of Official Languages, and she's a woman. I'm happy to say. And on the commission itself, there are, apart from me, there are 2 other women members, if I'm right. So that's a pretty good gender representation, I think. Where the commission is concerned. Now, in terms of women who work in language departments or linguistic departments or English departments in the university, I'm afraid I don't have specific statistics that speak to those numbers. But it, again, I think intuitively I feel that there are probably more women in English language departments and English language teaching departments than men. That's my feeling. But that might also have something to do with the staff ratio, the gender ratio of university level, tertiary level staff, because in 2019, the ratio was women represented 54.9%. So that's about 55, right? And the men represent 45%.
Okay.
This is tertiary education in Sri Lanka. The 15 universities and a couple more HEIs, higher education institutes, right? And what's also interesting is if we are talking about women in education, is if you look at the number of students. I have statistics for 3 years here, not for last year, not for the COVID year 2020, but I have statistics for 2016-17, 2017-18 and 2018-19. And in all 3 years, the number of women students far outstrips the number of men students. So we are looking at something like 37.7% for men in 2016-2017 as opposed to 62.3% for women. And the next year, it's 37.1% for men and 62.9% for women. And in the final year that's available on the UGC website, it's 36% for men and 64% for women. That's a big difference.
A big difference. Yes. So, Professor, women are at very high positions, and not only in the tertiary level, but I think even at a secondary level, when you think of teachers and when you think of teaching, where language actually is shaped, isn't it, Professor?
Definitely.
Women play an important role.
Definitely.
In society as
Absolutely,
well.
I would agree. And I'm thinking that maybe it has something to do with what I mentioned earlier, where women are the nurturers of children. And there's some kind of subconscious mechanism maybe in a woman's mind that they have this obligation to also be a teacher. In a very informal way in the home, but nevertheless to be a teacher. Because if a child mispronounces, talking of pronunciation, who's there to correct it? Probably the mother rather than the father. So that may be why we have a lot of women in the teaching profession. In any case, if you look at the arts faculties of the universities in Sri Lanka, the difference is huge. So it's 16.2% for men and 83.8% for women in arts and humanities.
And that's where most of the language departments are, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So the statistics speak as well. But Professor, let's talk a bit about students upon graduation and those who pursue courses in languages and education and their workforce. Do they get into the fields that require their expertise? For example, you were talking to me a bit about how perhaps understaffed perhaps language bodies in this country are. And that seems to be a pressing issue.
Indeed. I can, in terms of students who graduate from universities, I can only speak confidently with regard to my department, which is the Department of English at the University of Colombo. And I do know that several of our students from each batch go into the teaching profession. So that may answer your question. But our students go into lots of other professions as well. We have diplomats amongst our alumni. We have bankers. We have people who have gone into economic institutions. There are people who have gone into research. So it's a very wide, I think having a degree in English, particularly from the University of Colombo, equips you to do a lot of things once you graduate, not just teaching. So that's one thing. The other thing was, what was your other question?
Say, for example, language bodies in this country.
Yes.
For example, the Official Languages Commission perhaps oversees a range of bodies involved in language planning, policy, facilities. So in terms of that, Professor?
Absolutely. The Official Languages Commission, as I said earlier, performs a very important function, particularly in a multilingual country like Sri Lanka. And it is very sad that at the moment they are heavily understaffed. So I believe there are 42 cadre positions. In the Official Languages Commission has 42 cadre positions. I believe only about 21 or 22 are currently filled. So they are working at half strength. And how can they, as I said, they have a huge mandate. How can they perform that mandate when they are working at 50% of their strength?
Why do you think, Professor, these cadre positions are not filled?
Well, I think one of the issues is unfortunately financial. Because being because it's a government body, it's there are ceilings on what can be paid. Salary scales are very strictly regulated, and I think that's the problem. That maybe it's not attractive enough for our young graduates, for example, to work in a commission like that. For example, there's positions for 10 language officers at the OLC, and I think only 4 are filled. world.
And Professor, if you could talk a bit about the language officer, the role, what does a language officer do?
Well, a language officer, from my understanding, conducts language audits, which are very interesting. I only learnt about this after I became a member of the commission. So, yes, so one example of a language audit would be to go around to the railway stations in the country and check if announcements are being made in both Sinhala and Tamil. That would be an example of a language audit. And if that is not the case, then they can take, as I said earlier, remedial action. Another thing that these language officers do is they deal with complaints that come into the Official Languages Commission about a violation of language rights or institution that's not in compliance with the official language policy.
And I think that's a very, very important role that they serve.
Absolutely.
Because, Professor, if you can't understand the language, you're helpless, isn't it?
Absolutely. And especially in, say, the system of a court of law, for example, right? I mean, we know that in the colonial period, Sri Lankans were tried in English and they didn't even know what they were accused of, and some of them lost their lives as a result. So, yes, you have an absolute right to be able to defend yourself in your language. And we have two official languages in Sri Lanka, Sinhala and Tamil.
That is correct.
You have to have the right to be able to have a case heard in the language of that you are most comfortable in. And the point is, Mario, that right is guaranteed in the Constitution.
Yes, as you highlighted.
It is guaranteed in the Constitution. The problem is that in practice, it doesn't happen.
Professor, can someone who is obviously facing, say, discrimination because of language approach the commission?
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
Are you accessible?
Yes, in the sense that not me
but
as such,
as the spokesperson today representing the language commission.
They would contact the commission, which is located in Butgamu Road. That is where the officers are in Rajagiriya. That's who they would contact, not me personally.
Yeah, of course, yes. The Official Languages Commission of Sri Lanka. And I think talking about the Official Languages Commission of Sri Lanka is also very, very important, because people now know, or at least have been reminded of, that there is this commission. And if you are facing any linguistic discrimination, language discrimination, there is somewhere you can go and perhaps seek a remedy.
Absolutely.
Professor, time is ticking, and we'll have to conclude this very interesting program. But before we part, your final, perhaps, I wouldn't say advice, but your final parting comments, not only to the students out there as an academic, to those involved with language studies, with perhaps language policy making, with language education, teaching, and of course, researchers out there in Sri Lankan English, the topic of Sri Lankan Englishers, as you've highlighted. What would you like to say to those listeners out there before we conclude today?
Well, I would like to say that we have to be accepting of all the languages that are used and spoken in Sri Lanka. So maybe it's a little known fact that there are at least 6 languages which can be termed mother tongues or mother languages in Sri Lanka. So apart from Sinhala, Tamil and English, we also have Malay, Sri Lanka Malay. We have Sri Lanka Portuguese, and we have the language of the Adivasi population. So at least 6 languages. I use the word accepting because earlier we talked about discrimination, and we all know that there's a lot of discrimination against people who don't speak correct English, the so-called correct English. Well, we have to stop that. Because
and there's this word also, posh, this word that people perhaps, I've heard this used in social context. Well, we don't have the time to talk a bit about that, but I guess what you meant correct also, perhaps attitude, isn't it?
It's all to do with attitude. So that's what I said. We need to be more accepting of varieties, keeping in mind, of course, intelligibility. Certainly, if someone is talking or pronouncing in a way that you can't understand, then that would pose a problem of comprehension. But otherwise, if you can understand the person that you're speaking to or speaking with, what does it matter how they pronounce? Shall we say whole and hall? Or
but Professor, if whole and hall are pronounced, it as you said, it all depends on intelligibility and the context of what you are saying, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Professor Dushyanthi Mendis, Professor in English at the University of Colombo in Sri Lanka, for gracing our studios here this Tuesday morning, and very interesting conversation, and we hope to see you again in the future as well. And thank you once again for coming here.
As I said earlier, Mario, it was my pleasure. Thank you so much.
And as we wish you all the very best, Professor, with your future research and academic activities.